Welcome to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. Our podcast identifies issues that influence and impact the workplace and its continuing evolution, and helps answer the question on every organization's mind: how will my business be impacted? Remote work has given employers and employees path-breaking flexibility, but it has also raised a host of data and employee privacy concerns. On this episode of We Get Privacy for Work, we discuss what employers must consider when crafting policies and practices for remote workers. Today's hosts are Damon Silver and Joe Lazzarati, co-leaders of the firm's privacy, data, and cybersecurity group, and principals, respectively, in the firm's New York City and Tampa offices. Damon and Joe, the question on everyone's mind today is, what can employers do to effectively protect their data and employees from the cyber-related privacy concerns associated with remote work? And how does that impact my organization?
Welcome to the We Get Privacy podcast. I'm Damon Silver, and I'm joined by my co-host, Joe Lazzarati. Joe and I co-lead the privacy, data, and cybersecurity group at Jackson Lewis. And in that role, we receive a variety of questions every day from our clients, all of which boil down to the core question of how do we handle our data safely? In other words, how do we leverage all the great things that data can do for our organizations without running headfirst into a wall of legal risk? And how can we manage that risk without unnecessarily hindering our business operations?
On each episode of the podcast, Damon and I are going to talk through a common question that we're getting from our clients. And we're going to talk it through the same way we would talk it through with our clients. What this means is that we're going to focus on what's practical. We're going to think about what are the legal risks, what options they have to manage those risks, and what should we be mindful of from an execution perspective. So Damon, our question for the day is, what are some of the strategies for minimizing cyber privacy-related risks for organizations that have, significant remote workforce?
Yeah, so Joe, I think a good place to start is taking a look at how your remote employees are doing their work. In other words, have you issued all of them a company-owned laptop? Have you issued them company devices? If you are allowing them to use personal devices, do you have some type of mobile device management solution on that device? Because there's a number of risks we can talk about with respect to remote workforces, but a lot of them boil down to getting that understanding of the equipment and the technology that those employees are going to use, and what types of safeguards you can put around those uses. So maybe Joe, you want to jump into it, tackling either the BYOD component or the company issued device component, and talk through some of the key areas of focus?
Yeah, I think certainly, when you have employees using their own devices, it raises a lot of issues. And I think companies for a while have, gone to a BYOD approach, which kind of makes some sense. You allow the employee to use their own device. They sign on to that by, having a policy that governs how they use the device. For company purposes, you might have something that they sign, you might have a policy, and you might have some application that they download onto their device, which is where they're able to access, company email, calendar, and perhaps some other things. And that seems to be a fairly typical way of managing that activity if you have it set up that way. But even if you have company devices for people working remotely, I think one of the issues that's come up, just as an example, companies supplied their company printer, one of these printer scanner type devices, and the employee winds up terminating employment and says, "Hey, would you mind if I kept the printer? Really probably is worth nothing." And the company's like, "Sure, no big deal." And they go their separate ways. And then all of a sudden you realize that the scanner and the printer has a hard drive, and a lot of the documents that were scanned with that device are saved on that device. So just even so, in other words, even if it's company equipment, you could run into some of these kinds of issues. So to your point, Damon, I mean, thinking about how you safeguard that, what approach that you take, whether it's company equipment or whether it's personal equipment, you kind of run into those things with remote workforce. I think another issue with this from a privacy perspective. I mean, we're focused kind of on the privacy and security of the data that's being managed by the employee remotely, but there's also the privacy of the employee remotely, right? A lot of the struggle with this is, people are not in front of you. There's no FaceTime. And so all of a sudden you're wondering, is that person out, working in the yard? Are they at the beach? Do they have doing something else and not, being active? There's apps, I think, that could make your mouse move and make the employer think that you're actually doing. So there's these platforms. Maybe you can talk a little bit about these productivity platforms and how that plays into the process of managing this remote workforce.
Absolutely. I had one quick point I wanted to add on just the last issue we were discussing around the equipment and applications that employees are using, because you're absolutely right. Even if it's company issued, you can still run into issues, and a lot of those issues center around the degree of control that you continue to have over your data and your data environment. Because I've had a number of clients have situations where they terminated an employee who was working remotely. They sent that employee, a prepaid box to send back their laptop, and the employee for a while didn't do it. We ended up having to send demand letters and do this whole thing. But meanwhile, there was a couple months sometimes that passed between when the employee was terminated and when they returned the device. And in a couple of those instances, the client was in a heavily regulated industry like healthcare. And so the question became, did the employee continue to access PHI that may have been stored locally on their device or even on the company systems if we didn't cut off their access during that period? So, both with personal devices and company devices, you do want to think about, what would happen if this device were lost? What will happen if the employee refuses to return it to us? Do we have some way of making sure that we're able to remotely wipe that information, or we're able to see the activity? We have logging of the activity, on that device in the same way that we would if the employee was working from the office, because your obligations related to your data are just as stringent when the employee is in the office as when they're elsewhere. But sometimes what can change is you have a lot less control. Jumping to the point you mentioned, Joe, around the privacy rights of the employee, we have seen a huge increase, understandably, in the use of various types of electronic monitoring tools, both for purposes of assessing the productivity of the client's workforce, and also to make sure that they're complying with company policies and standards and all of that. And there are a number of privacy issues that can come up in that context. Some of them, as with the issue of personal versus company devices, the degree of risk will turn on that factor. If the electronic monitoring tool results in the monitoring of an employee's activity in their own Facebook account, their own email account, which could totally happen if the employee is using a personal device or even using a company device and they log into their personal account. And because there are pretty extensive monitoring tools being run by the employer, they may end up seeing communications. They can see searches that are run. So that's definitely something to be mindful of. You could also run into issues with recording of communications where there might be an obligation to notify to avoid liability under a wiretap law, like the California Invasion of Privacy Act, or there's similar laws in 11 or so other states. So those are some of the common issues that come up with the use of these monitoring tools. Any others that you want to flag, Joe?
So there's a couple, right? Well, one is that you have increasingly the potential for people to work remotely from a lot of different places. And they may be residents of different countries, and now they have access and maybe storing data in those other countries. And so the question becomes, do you now in some way or based upon your business become subject to another, law in another country? And then if so, how does that impact your compliance obligations? Does it trigger a provision in a customer agreement where the customer says, we don't want that data stored outside the United States? Right? Damon, we look at a lot of agreements. I don't know about you, but I'm seeing, I do see a lot of that certainly in certain industries where businesses are saying, we want to keep that data in the U.S. Another issue with remote workers is, kind of two kind of similar situations where an employer. I've seen several clients come. And I'm curious, Damon, if you've run into this, where a client hires someone, they go through the interview process, they have Zoom meetings, they make the decision to hire, they hire the person, and then 6 months later, they start to scratch their head and say, I don't know, so and so. I don't think that's the person we hired. It doesn't sound like them. Like who is that person? And in a more nefarious case, there have been a lot of reports, and we've been working with some clients on certain nation states that are using this model to infiltrate companies, and that's become more of a law enforcement issue and working with law enforcement for those situations. But this idea of trying to identify and know who are these people that we're hiring, and do they, is there some, validation and authentication process we need to ensure that when we hire someone and we allow them access to our systems, but we're not seeing them every day. They're not at the water cooler, right? They're just on some screen. Is that who we say we're hiring? So those are a couple of things that I think are really, creating some risk for employers.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more to add to that, building off the idea of you don't necessarily know where people are, is some of these monitoring tools will very precisely track geolocation. And so you can run into issues where an employee, brings their laptop with them to their doctor's appointment, or they bring their laptop to the church or the temple that they go to after work, or to another location in which arguably they have some expectation of privacy, and they're not thinking necessarily about the fact that their employer will know where they are. And that is fortunately something that can be addressed pretty effectively through policies, making sure there's a clear disclosure of the fact that certain devices or certain applications are going to track location, and that employees who choose to bring, say, a company laptop with them when attending to personal business should not have any expectation of privacy in the places that they choose to visit. But that is something to think about as well. And it may not even be the intention of the company. They probably don't want to know necessarily where their employees are going off hours, but unless technical controls are put in place and disclosures are made, that's another area of risk that we've seen come up.
Yeah, I think it's clear, like with a lot of issues we're talking about, this is one of those where you really want to think about what your overall strategy is from the standpoint of what devices, what data are remote workers using, how are we managing them, from a productivity perspective, and also managing their privacy rights, and how do we manage that expectation, and then how do we know who we're dealing with, right? How do we validate who they are, among other issues? So kind of developing a policy and a strategy to deal with that involves HR and IT, and maybe thinking about your vendor agreements, your customer agreements, to kind of make sure that you're not running into any issues. Anything else, Damon? Think we're good for this one? Can make this one a wrap?
Yeah, Joe, I think that's a great place to wrap this one.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to our We Get Privacy podcast. Hope this is helpful for you. As always, if you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at privacy@jacksonlewis.com. Damon, as always, pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you for listening to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. Focused solely on workplace issues, it is our job to help organizations develop proactive strategies, strong policies, and business-oriented solutions to cultivate a workforce that is engaged and stable. Please tune into our next program where we will continue to tell you not only what's legal, but what is effective. We Get Work is available to stream and subscribe on your streaming platform of choice, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. For more information on today's topic, our presenters, and other Jackson Lewis resources, visit jacksonlewis.com. As a reminder, this material is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create a client-lawyer relationship between Jackson Lewis and any recipient.